What's up, guys? Also Footballtalk here, back for the second video on the journey to breaking down every single NFL team's draft classes and roster overall to some degree, going division by division, alternating between NFC and AFC. Once again, as we talk about the AFC North today, I'll give a quick scouting report on every player that I've watched, which makes up for about 90% of this draft, talk about their fit in the roster and how that works with the other moves that they've made this offseason, and then at the end of every video, I'll rank the four drafts against each other, largely based on my personal evaluations, but also how they approached the draft overall, the plan that they followed, and how well they were able to execute it, so to speak. I'll mention any moves that we saw beforehand in order to give some context, but for the purpose of this exercise, I'll only talk about trades, take those into account that actually happened during the draft. You can find in-depth positional breakdowns and a bunch of other draft-related stuff on my page at footballtalk.com if you really want to dive in. Just a quick heads up, if you can't tell, I'm dealing with COVID right now, so please bear with me here as I'm trying to get back to 100%, but like I said last time already, I love doing this series every year, and I hope that you can appreciate the effort that I put into these breakdowns. Timestamps for each individual team and the divisional draft rankings are down below, but now let's get into it with the first team here being the Baltimore Ravens. Saying that they've been one of the best drafting teams over the last 2 decades, I believe is not hyperbolic. And they've kind of kicked it up another notch these last 2 years, I believe, which 2022 was another example of that. I'll just quickly run down the names here. First round, 14th overall, Kyle Hamilton, the safety out of Notre Dame. Then later in the first, 25th overall, Tyler Linderbaum, the interior offensive lineman out of Iowa. Second round, 45th overall, David Ojabo, the edge defender out of Michigan. And then in the third round, 76th overall, Travis Jones, the interior defensive lineman out of UConn. And then they had 6 fourth-round picks. Daniel Falele, offensive tackle, Minnesota. Jalen Armour-Davis, cornerback, Alabama. Charlie Kolar, tight end out of Iowa State. Jordan Stout, punter out of Penn State. Isaiah Likely, tight end, Coastal Carolina. Demarion Williams, the cornerback out of Houston. And then finally in the 6th round, 196th overall, Tyler Beatty, the running back out of Missouri. And kind of the crazy part about saying how well they've drafted is that despite that, I don't even look at their first selection being this crazy steal like some other people are talking about. Not that I don't like Hamilton at all. To me, he was right at value here. I just think people don't have the right picture of him as this extremely versatile player, when I think he has a more narrow skill set in terms of the coverage perspective at least. Obviously, unicorn-like frame at 6'4", 220 pounds with an 80-inch wingspan. You look at him being able in the box from 2 high shells, even at times as a single high safety, that ability to come down and contribute in run support, and really be a secure tackle as well, missing just 2 of his 32 tackling attempts in 2021. For his career, you look at the coverage numbers, Hamilton has been responsible for just 39 completions on 82 targets, for less than 400 yards and 1 touchdown, while intercepting 8 passes himself, kind of playing all over the map for that Irish defense, whether it's in the big slot, put him as a single high safety, they've done pretty much everything with him. However, I believe his range at this point is kind of overrated because everybody's referring to that Florida State interception that he had where he was on 1 hash and picked it off all the way on the opposite sideline. Great instinctual play, obviously, but you saw it as well at the Combine and the Pro Day, running the 5.45s. And there are some issues with him flipping and sticking with slot receivers down the field and that ability to relocate the football. I just think he's a bit more of a straight line athlete than people are kind of giving credit for in terms of maybe not having that bend, almost, I want to call it. Curving his path to some degree when he has to adjust to something and stuff like that. I hope you kind of can get what I mean here, but looking at the Ravens already having brought in Marcus Williams as the big free agency addition, Chuck Clark has been a green dot guy for them, but I think we'll see Hamilton in the slot a lot this year, and maybe make Clark expendable next year as this player, if they want to play more single high coverages, have Williams as the center field on the back end, and then Hamilton underneath, kind of cleaning everything up. That would make a lot of sense if that's the way they want to go here and make a bit of a transition here defensively under the new defensive coordinator, Mike McDonald. And then later in the first, or rather just a couple of picks later, it was announced that they traded away wide receiver Marquise Brown to the Arizona Cardinals in exchange for pick number 23, and I think they also gave up pick 100 in the process themselves, which they ultimately moved back a couple of spots here with Buffalo and picked up a 4th rounder along the way. And this really was a great move for them because they used pick 25 on Brown 3 years ago and now got his services at minimal capital for that stretch before they actually have to pay him. And I'd say at best he's lived up to that draft capital, so really just the smart heads of move kind of fleeced the Cardinals here. And with the 25th pick, they brought in Linderbaum, who was a top 10 overall prospect for me, came to Iowa as a defensive lineman, and after switching sides of the football, he found some early success before ultimately finishing as a Remington Trophy Award winner, is clearly the top center in the country. Dude just jumps out of his stance and has the natural pad leverage advantage for him to make impact in the run game with an ability, the great agility to work across the face of defensive linemen and seal off defenders on the backside. Just in terms of the wide zone, pin and pull kind of run schemes. You can really do anything with him just because of his athleticism for the position. And in the pass game as well, tremendous ability to absorb force through his mobility in his joints. So even though he's not the biggest guy, he has that ability to just lower himself, sink his hips, and hold his ground as a pass protector, as well as great awareness, obviously, for stuff that's going on around him and movement skills laterally. I do understand why some people pigeonhole him as a center in a zone-based system, however, just due to the lack of size. He's ranked at the bottom 6 percentile across the board in terms of physical dimensions, including absurdly short 31.5-inch arms, so there may be some limitations in terms of just a power-based system, which is an interesting thing because the Ravens have been so much about creating that vertical movement, just driving guys off the ball and mashing defenses inside, while Lamar Jackson gives him that outside threat when he pulls the ball. But I think Linderbaum, obviously great pick, immediately will replace Bradley Bozeman at the center spot and probably diversifies the run schemes with his movement skills to some degree, where maybe we see more pin and pull and just getting to the edges of the defense. Then in the second round, Ojabo, kind of the pivotal selection of this draft, because if Ojabo gets back to his usual self, this is obviously a slam dunk pick, but they were able to afford a pick like this due to the rest of the moves that they've made. So they are more likely to take a chance on a guy like this who is uber talented. Ojabo didn't start playing football until he was 17 and kind of had to wait his turn behind the great line of defensive ends from Michigan. But in his first season as a starter, he recorded 11 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, and knocked down 3 passes. Great explosion of the ball and ability to reduce his near shoulder, and then the twitchiness to threaten inside and out as a pass rusher, to win in different ways and kind of just put the offensive tackles on skates. However, he is more of a weak spot in the run game at this point, trying to ID schemes and just kind of holding his ground at the point of attack, while lacking the power element as a rusher to some degree as well. And obviously tore his Achilles at the Michigan Pro Day earlier in March, so he's probably not gonna see any action during the regular season, has the time to recover there, and maybe he'll give them a boost in the playoffs before making a real impact in 2023. But like I said, how he turns out is gonna determine how great this class can be. And then in the third round, Travis Jones. Ravens didn't get Jordan Davis at 14th overall, which was actually the pick that some people rejected him to get Ojabo early. And then it was Davis as kind of the consensus selection for them. But I think here they actually get much better value, even though Davis was a top 10 overall prospect for me, and they got kind of sniped maybe by the Eagles moving up just ahead of them. But they get a guy here who some people thought could have been a first rounder, and I saw personally in that top 50 range myself. And if not for Davis being a superhuman, we'd marvel at Jones's combine showing, running a 4.92 and being tied for the best free cone among the interior defensive line at 325 pounds. This guy has the natural force to reset the line of scrimmage, tossing guys to the side and making plays in the ball carrier. And despite being more of a one-trick pony in passing down so far in terms of creating push up the middle of the pocket, and you saw it at the Senior Bowl, just riding guys backwards into the lap of the QB, he racked up 25 pressures on just about 300 chances, so that's not bad considering where he's lining up and him really being the only threat on the D-line for UConn. At this point, just very little nuance to his game, being caught on the wrong side of blocks and needing to diversify his pass rush arsenal, obviously. At UConn, he just mostly got by with natural power and athletic ability, which he'll have to become more of a savvy player at the NFL level. So I could see him maybe rotating through with Michael Pierce early on at the nose, and we could see both guys on the field at the same time. We saw it with Brandon Williams as well. But I believe that Jones is the long-term replacement for Williams at the nose. And Pierce has an out in his contract next year, I believe. So that would make a lot of sense for him to be the new rock of this defense. And I really think he has all the talent to be that kind of guy. Then we get to Falele, who kicked off day 3 for them, which included 6 fourth-round picks, like I already mentioned. This Aussie is a behemoth who towers at 6'8", 387 pounds, with a massive 86-inch wingspan and 11-inch hands. For that size, he has pretty impressive lateral agility to reach, block, or cut off defenders on the backside of zone runs, along with just being the sheer size, defenders not being able to see through him and track the ball carrier. And then also on passing downs, just that huge frame and the length, along with pretty good movement skills, make it very tough for defenders to get around him. And you saw that, only giving up 1 sack and 7 additional pressures on 300 pass blocking snaps last season. I would like to see more urgency coming off the ball and take advantage of his size to really overpower much smaller edge defenders, which we don't see a ton of with him. And in the pass game, shift his way too far to the outside foot at times versus speed, which makes him vulnerable to the inside. So I think he's going to have to settle in a little bit in terms of his technique there. But with the Ravens bringing in Morgan Moses this offseason as probably the start at the right tackle spot, they still have Jawan James on the roster, who was a free agency addition for them last year. Maybe Falele gets a full year to develop, potentially fitting in a guard or being the swing tackle in terms of certain run packages. But he should be the long-term plan at right tackle, and maybe gives them another guy who they already had in the Landon Brown Jr. at that right tackle spot as this massive dude there. Next up, we got Jalen Armour-Davis, the cornerback out of Alabama. Basically has prototype measurements for the position at 6'1.5", 195 pounds with 4.37 speed. And he only had 1 season as a starter, but with all the great line of corners that they have at Alabama there, but had one of the better seasons among all cornerbacks in the country in terms of pure coverage perspective. Only 1 catch of 25 plus yards in 2021, no touchdowns versus his 3 interceptions, and also willing contributor in the run game, a very reliable tackle in open field situations, just 2 missed tackles on the year. He wasn't able to get onto the field for defensive snaps at all, basically, until his 3rd healthy season. And the question for him is play strength. If receivers being able to push off at the top of routes and that ability just to fight off blocks. So those are some things that he has to work on and just get strong in that regards. But the Ravens losing Anthony Averett and Tavon Young this offseason, so I could easily see him be the number 3 on the outside, especially if they want to move Humphrey more to the inside again with Young being gone. So that would make a lot of sense, and I really think that he can play right away. And then we got a couple of tight ends, which I'll talk to here. First, Charlie Kolar, large dude at 6'6.5", 255 pounds with an 82-inch wingspan and big hands. But has a very crafty game, and I actually called him a Travis Kelce light in my positional rankings. With his ability to just work himself open, find voided areas in zone coverage and stuff like that. Only dropped 5 of 173 catchable targets in his career, so he has reliable hands as well. And he's been one of the more productive talents in college football with just over 2,000 yards over the last 3 years combined. I wouldn't say he's a very explosive athlete, with just 1 catch of 20 plus air yards in 2021 and averaging just 3.7 yards after the catch. Plus, he's more so a positional blocker when used in line, most of what they already have in Mark Andrews, where he's basically more of a big slot receiver. At least that's what he was used to as Iowa State, and they had another guy who they used more in line and allowed him to get those free releases and stuff like that. So Kolar probably going to back up Mark Andrews. And now if you put the both on the field, you have 2 wicked route runners on the field with talent size. So kind of a change maybe in the offensive philosophy, but I really like what those 2 bodies can bring to the field and the issues that they can present for defense. And then Isaiah Likely, kind of a different player. Just one thing quickly here. I heard later from Peter King, who was allowed to be in the Ravens draft room, that they were ready to take Memphis wide receiver Calvin Austin here before the Steelers snatched him away from pick earlier. So I talked about him being the perfect replacement for Marquise Brown, and I would have personally loved that. But luckily still, my number 3 tight end, actually slightly ahead of Kolar. Like I said, a different type of player at the position. Increased his numbers all 4 years with the Chanticleers and really jumped onto the national scene last season with 900 yards and 12 touchdowns as a receiver. Also, super reliable hands in terms of adjusting to slightly off-target throws and still bringing the ball without having to slow down a whole lot for it. Only dropped 1 pass in the season. And he was an explosive player for the Chanticleers with 10 catches of 20 plus yards and 10 missed tackles forced. He did, however, run a head-scratching 4.8 flat at the Coastal Carolina Pro Day, which was very surprising considering the tape that you saw him having, I think actually a 99-yard touchdown on tape at some point. And in contested situations, very unproven, only hauled in 4 of 10 contested situations. And just very limited experience as an inline blocker, more so an H-back probably. Excelled on those on-the-move blocks in the jet sweep game and stuff like that, but not really going to put his hand in the dirt and move people in the run game. So he's probably going to be more of your yards after catch specialist and move option, which is also interesting because now you got Andrews, Kolar, and potentially likely on the field at the same time. That's going to be tough for defenses to pick those guys up, even though they maybe lack some options on the outsides that can really threaten the defense. But then in between those guys, just quickly, Jordan Stout, first punt off the board, with the Ravens hearing rumors about the Bucs having the eyes set on the position, which they actually picked the guy 3 picks later, so that makes some sense. Stout was the most accurate punter in football his last season, with just over 20% of his kicks being returned, and the 4th highest net yards at 44.5 yards. Certainly a bit early here for a punter, it's just my personal opinion, but you saw the run on special teamers here in the 4th round. I think they were overall 4 selected within the next 20 picks or so it made sense for them if there are some rumors to get the guy, especially they only had 1 pick later in the 4th round, but like I said, if they get Calvin Austin here and whatever punter on the undrafted free agent market, I probably prefer that. But let's move on to Demarion Williams, the corner out of Houston, 2-time team captain, and head coach Dana Holgerson actually called him an absolute warrior, with some experience also lining up safety. You see him super patient off the line, stop his momentum well to be able to contest routes, and he's quickly to drive down on breaks and consistently rakes through the hands of receivers. So I really like what he brings there, a very feisty player, and then also effectively wrestling ball carriers to the ground. The physical profile is a bit underwhelming, only his 29.5-inch arms and average play strength, I would say, giving him a tough time for getting off blocks, and also modest 4.53 speed, with no real makeup element if there's a false step or he gets caught leaning the wrong way. So he's going to give them some snaps in the slot probably, trying to rebuild that depth in the secondary. Maybe a tiny bit early for me, but not as surprising with the type of guys that the Ravens have brought in the secondary recently. And then finally Tyler Bate in the 6th round, I really like a lot. My number 8 overall running back, was barely being used as kind of this 3rd down option for Missouri before it became the Tigers' workhorse in 2021, touching the ball 322 times for nearly 2,000 yards and 18 touchdowns, which included 54 receptions. Guy really just can stick his foot in the ground, accelerate through cuts, can incorporate head and foot fakes to kind of keep defenders off balance and create dynamic plays in the run and the pass game, where he quickly turns upfield once the ball is in his hands and has the ability to make people miss. He does, however, get hung up with defenders who are able to grab a part of his body when he's trying to shoot through a hole. And in pass pro, you see kind of dips his head and just lacks the mass to really stand in there against blitzers, as well as in the pass game, also a very simplistic route tree at Missouri, as much as he was involved in that regard. But he's likely going to be a replacement for Justice Hill as somebody with receiving skills and more that dynamic skill set, along with the bangers that they have on the roster. J.K. Dobbins kind of can do it all, but also Gus Edwards, really more of a north-south oriented runner. I think they brought in Mike Davis. So that makes some sense in terms of a low-budget investment, who I believe really can make an impact down the road if he gets the chances. So another tremendous talent haul here for Baltimore, getting anywhere from even to major plus value in 8 of the 10 selections that they made in terms of players that I actually had ranked on my big board. Ojabo was the one I didn't have a definite spot for, simply because I struggled with judging an Achilles tear without the medical background to really put it into perspective in regards to draft position. But if he gets back to 100%, getting him an away off either edge will be tremendous for them. We, and at least I, don't quite understand how Moto will be deployed, but he can be an excellent player in a role that allows him to play to his strength. You get the number 1 center and a top 10 overall prospect for me after losing a starter, have that great trade with the Cardinals to acquire him for, let's say, number 2 receiver. Let's call it what it really is. Jones is the new rock of the defense in place of Brandon Williams. Valele having the potential to become what he had in Orlando Brown Jr. Ahmad Davis probably slotting in as the number 3 right away, later than expected getting him here. You get 2 different tight ends, with Cola being more of the mold of Andrews as this guy who can win with crafty route running, and likely more of a move/yak guy. And then Beatty Late is a dynamic passing down back. I mean, come on. Panther in the 4th, I don't love. Demarion Williams maybe a little bit early for my taste as well, but he can definitely play, even if his upside may be capped. So really the only issue that I had with them was the fact that they didn't get a wide receiver with how that room looks like right now, having traded away Hollywood. But at this point, we're just looking for things to criticize here. So I'm just going to move on to the Cincinnati Bengals here instead, who after picking Joe Burrow number 1 overall just 2 years ago, now didn't get onto the clock until the penultimate pick of round 1, where they selected Daxton Hill, the safety out of Michigan, Then second round 60th overall, Cam Taylor-Britt, the cornerback out of Nebraska. Third round 95th overall, Zach Ricardo, the edge/interior defensive lineman out of Florida. Fourth round 136th overall, Cordell Wilson, the offensive tackle/interior O-lineman out of North Dakota State. Fifth round 166th overall, Tyson Anderson, the safety out of Toledo. And finally 7th round 252 overall, Jeffrey Gunter, the edge defender out of Coastal Carolina. First up here with Dax Hill, who spent about 3/4 of his snaps in the slot last season, along with rotating into the deep middle a few times. You look at him, elite change of direction, you saw it in the testing as well at the combine, that ability to click and close on routes, as well as 32.25 inch arms is pretty good for that size, and then his 4.38 speed that really shows up on tape, being able to make plays outside his area. You see him a few times in the deep post, which is actually where maybe I like him best in terms of just the range that he brings to the table. However, he does simply lack size to consistently work through contact in a run game, and he did miss 10 tackles last season. At his height, I think right around the 6-foot mark, has some problems against Blake slot receivers, could be even a bigger issue in the NFL with how many power slots we see there. And one thing that also showed up on tape, kind of loses his focus at times late, and the loss separation on secondary routes. So I may actually be slightly lower than the consensus on Hill, but I still really like him as a player in terms of somebody who can play in the slot or the deep post. My question is, where does he really fit on this defense? Because they have Mike Hilton as one of the best nickels in the NFL. Jesse Bates has this tremendous range free safety. And then Hill isn't really the guy you want to drive down on routes or play in the box or anything like that. So I'm a bit confused as to where they think he'll fit. Because if they don't consider putting him at outside corner, he's probably a replacement for one of those two guys that I mentioned. Just because they don't want to pay their stars and give them money beyond year one. Particularly Bates, if they were to lose him, and he's already talked about how he wouldn't sign the franchise tag, I'd really hate that. They went back-to-back with the secondary here when they got Taylor-Britt, who was a top 10 corner for me personally. Elite physical profile with a 4.38 speed, and at times you see him carry guys down the field and be able to bring his head around early than the receiver actually, along with some incredible moments of recovering. I'm not 100% sure who it was against, but I actually shared a clip where if you watch the broadcast view, which I did originally during the season, he's not even on the screen when we see a pass towards the end zone, kind of got caught down in the flats as a cover 2 defender, I believe, and he comes all the way back there and makes a one-handed interception, just has that ability to make plays outside his area, recover late, and as well, playing near the line of scrimmage, that physicality, that will to get involved in the run game and bring bigger bulk areas to the ground, as well as blitzing skills from the backside, the tremendous pursuit speed. That's why some people actually projected him to play safety at the next level. I think he can play either one. Although at this point, it's more about seeing routes and anticipating for him. He also got burned pretty badly by some double moves thanks to how aggressive he is to the initial break. And as a tackler, he just needs to start bringing his arms with him. However, I think he'll be a long-term replacement for Eli Apple as that number 2 outside cornerback. Maybe not right away because there are some things that he has to clean up in terms of the aggressiveness, understanding how to react to breaks accordingly, but I really like the potential that he brings to the table. And then we get to Zach Carter, who is this interesting edge defender, can also play on the inside, reduce, has spent time at free technique as a traditional 4-3 defensive end, head up on the offensive tackle, has 33.5-inch arms and 10.5-inch hands, with the ability to really lock out and own his space in the run game. And last season, I thought I also saw a little more juice off the edge to consistently condense the pocket from that spot with the power as he transitions to it and then rip through to clear the hips of the blocker. He's somebody who brings that versatility in terms of the alignment. However, a bit of a tweener, obviously, with modest testing numbers, and doesn't get string moves together particularly well as a pass rusher. So with them losing Larry Ogunjobi, who gave them a penetration-style play at the free technique, I think Carter can replace some of that, and then they also just like those tweener body types kind of with the guys that they have there already, so it makes some sense, somebody who can move up and down the line in passing downs. Which next up on day 3, their first pick was Cordell Wilson, who was a super experienced player, having started his final 41 games in North Dakota State, over which the Bison averaged nearly 300 yards rushing per game every season. Somebody during East-West Shrine practices also moving inside, just an ability to create movement in the run game laterally and horizontally. And in the pass game, just very much plays within himself, understands not to overreact to moves that defenders may throw at him, and just standing his ground. You see this well, never gave up a sack on only 14 total pressures on just over 1,000 pass blocking snaps these last 3 years combined. I would say for the offensive tackle spot, more of a modest athlete, with his broad jump actually being the only common event slightly above the average. And in the run game also you see him gets his weight too far over his toes at times and looks rather heavy-footed when he gets out in space. So maybe going to be a sixth man early on, but I think he'll be perfect in that role with the additions that they made on the offensive line. Not any of those splash signings, but just building up a solid front five where I really think he could be starting over Jackson Carman or Alex Kappa at either guard spot. Tackles are kind of pretty much set. But at worst, like I said, he's going to be the number one backup for everything they have other than the center spot and be a very valuable player for the team that is looking to make another run here and had some issues when they were dealing with injuries. Then in the 50 went the Tyson Anderson, who is another kind of a physical specimen, 33-inch arms and 10-inch hands, which he uses extremely well to keep his frame clean, and only missed about 10% of his tackling attempts these past 2 seasons combined. You look at it, somebody who played a lot as kind of this big nickel, setting the edge in the run game, but also the speed. You saw that the combined 4.36 in the 40, that ability to carry routes vertically from the slot, and the rapid plant and drive to make plays as receivers break their routes off. The coverage numbers this past season didn't look as great, allowing 22 of 31 targets to be completed his way with 2 touchdowns and no picks for a passer rating of 114. And overall for his career, very underwhelming ball production, which you look at his role as well, not being used a whole lot as a deep safety. So with them being pretty thin at safety in Cincinnati behind Bates and Von Bell, now you got 3 strong options as well in the slot, so it makes some sense here. Just probably more in the mold of what they have in Von Bell and giving you some time against tight ends maybe with the length that he brings to the table, so he's going to be a matchup piece in that perspective. And then finally Jeffrey Gunter, an all gas, no breaks type of player with a hot motor, and he actually finished in the top 10 in the 40 and both the jumps at the common for the position, so he has some explosiveness that he brings to the table, has some force in his hands in the run game, and that ability to just keep on working as a pass rusher. You look at the numbers last season, 34 total pressures on 258 pass rush snaps. That's pretty damn good. However, in the run game also losing containment vision on the ball on too many occasions. And there is some tightness in his hips trying to turn the corner as a rusher. So he's probably going to be the number 6 defensive end on the depth chart right now and maybe start in the practice squad. But he's a guy with the energy he brings to the table, can be elevated and give him solid snaps. The Bengals only made 6 total selections, but I think the first 4 can make an immediate impact, even if only half of them end up starting right away. And they got a couple of other depth pieces in the 5th and 6th each. As I mentioned at the top with Hill, he's the one I'm not totally sure about yet what his role will be, but coming off a Super Bowl, they must have something in mind in terms of the short term for a first rounder. Taylor Britt may not be starting week 1, but he could easily replace Eli Apple at some point this year and certainly after the season. While they needed more options on the outside anyway, Carter is another rotational piece on the D-line, which relied heavily on moving bodies, rotating guys through, and has that inside-out flexibility as well. Wilson, like I mentioned, is this perfect 6-man on the O-line for a team that is looking to make another run, and now you have that insurance for the guys that he brought in free agency. And finally, Anderson and Gunter as these high-energy backups with good athletic profiles. So I certainly like what they did, despite not being the biggest players in this draft. And that is us moving on to the Cleveland Browns, who didn't own the first-round pick and won't next year either, alongside other draft capital that they gave up for quarterback Deshaun Watson. However, they did have 3 picks in the 3rd round, 6th to 8th overall, Martin Emerson, the cornerback out of Mississippi State, 78th overall, Alex Wright, the edge defender out of UAB, and 99th overall, David Bell, the wide receiver out of Purdue. 2 picks in the 4th round, 108th overall, Perrin Winfrey, the interior defensive lineman out of Oklahoma, and Cade York, the kicker out of LSU. Then in the 5th round, 156th overall, Jerome Ford, the running back out of Cincinnati, and 6th round, 202nd overall, Mike Woods, the wide receiver out of Oklahoma, along with 2 7th round picks, Isaiah Thomas, the edge defender / interior D lineman out of Oklahoma, and Dawson Deaton, the interior offensive lineman out of Texas Tech. So in Emerson, they got this long physical outside corner, ranks in the 91st percentile for height and 98th percentile in arm length for 33.5 inches, as well as hand size with over 10 inches, as well as 4.53 speed is pretty solid in terms of the player that he is for that. And the length is really a makeup tool in terms of being just a step off and just being able to still work through the hands of the receiver at the catch point or just getting a finger on it. And in the run game as well, working up that willingness to get involved. Missed only 5 of 50 tackle attempts last season as well. And was able to create a lot of stops on short completions, that awareness for where the sticks are in zone coverage, along obviously with that length, being able to crowd receivers at the line of scrimmage as well as the catch point. However, he did have very limited ball production in 2019 and 21, combining for just 5 pass breakups and 1 interception. In off coverage, you see him play a lot of flat-footed and kind of catch receivers way too much, which will be flagged every single time by NFL referees, as well as he was not going to be a fit for every single team in terms of what they want to do in coverage. But now with the starting trio probably in Cleveland of Denzel Ward, who they just paid big bucks to, Greedy Williams being a second-round pick a couple of years ago, and then Greg Newsome being the first-rounder last year. Emerson probably on the bench for now, but the first guy off it and a quality option there who can be deployed against bigger bodies. Just a bit surprising that this was how they were going to go with the first pick here. And then Alex Wright, I'm not a huge fan of. Stands tall at 6'5" with a massive 84-inch wingspan. Delivers some real knockback at first contact with blockers in the run game. And just somebody with a superior athletic profile was able to give blockers problems. Had 6 sacks along with 46 other pressures and 276 pass rush snaps last season. However, his get-off is nothing to really write home about. And because he's rather high-hipped and lacks some flexibility in the lower half, he can't quite clear the blocker's hips a lot of times, as well as in the run game, kind of over-eager to jump inside. So probably going to be behind Chase Winovich early on, who they traded for. But just because they don't have many quality options there as that defensive end across from Myles Garrett, where I could see plenty of time early on, even though I don't believe he's quite ready for it. And then David Bell, I do like. I kind of exploded in terms of the stats in 2021 when he touched the ball 96 times for over 1,300 yards and 6 touchdowns, leading to him being a first-team All-American selection. Super crafty receiver with the way that he stems his routes and can create some late separation when tangled up. Being able to win on all 3 levels of the field. And he did have 25 missed tackles forced last season with a stocky lower body to be able to break tackles and just the physicality to drop his shoulder and work through contact. However, only one receiver at the combine ran a slower 40 than him at 4.65, and he had the worst mark in 20-yard shuttle as well. He simply lacks that extra gear to detach vertically or really threaten defense with his twitch, so there may be some capped upside, but he could be a productive player for them right away, I believe, at Z or most of the slot maybe, along with Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones there. Just somebody who's ready to reproduce right away and make some sense here. Then in the 4th round with Winfrey, such a unique body composition with a pretty rectangular frame that barely has any fat on it, a massive 85.5-inch wingspan, along with 10.5-inch hands, and it looks like almost he has no neck when he has his helmet on. Somebody who's very interesting in the way that he can contort his body and flash with plays in the backfield. Had 30 total pressures and less than 300 pass rush snaps this past season, despite lining up at the nose and having to work across multiple gaps a lot of times. But he's just too often laid out of his stance, wasn't asked to play much gap control in the run game at Oklahoma, and somewhat unrefined as a pass rush as well, where he often just crashes into blockers with his head and isn't really looking to set up moves in particular. So looking at what he did at the Senior Bowl, where he was really the high energy guy who lifted everybody up and was able to be a disruptive playmaker, just not conducive that environment that he was in Oklahoma necessarily to him putting up big numbers, but in the right system there on the D-line along with Garrett. I think he can make some big plays, and he's going to be in the mix for a starting spot along with Jordan Elliott, Tommy Togiai, who he drafted last year and I like quite a bit, and then Taven Bryan. Just questioning where's the size really on that D-line, which is the way that I thought they would go maybe with all those earlier picks. But Winfrey I like a lot as a player, and I think kind of a steal here in the 4th round, just because of some of the off-the-field stuff apparently that people are worried about. But just in terms of the pure evaluation, I like a lot. And then they went with the second 4th round pick and a kicker here with Cade York, who was the first and only kicker actually drafted this year. And it came within the first 20 picks of day 3, so I don't love that, because it kind of feels like an overreaction to the kicker last year in Chase McLaughlin, having an NFL low field goal percentage at 70.5%. York was generally considered the top option at this year, with field goal percentages above the 83 percentile the last 2 years for the Tigers, and he didn't miss any extra points over that stretch either. So it makes some sense for them in terms of just making an improvement and probably going to have an immediate impact just pretty early, and considering there was no other kicker drafted, him kind of kicking off that run on special teamers but only punters after that. Just in terms of the draft capital invested, I'm not a huge fan of it, but he's going to make an impact and it's going to be an improvement probably at that spot. And then we get to Jerome Ford, who I really love. Originally recruited by Alabama and was kind of burned in the depth chart there before he decided to transfer to Cincinnati, He was the number 2 behind Gary Dokes in 2020, and then finally became the workhorse as a senior when he touched the ball 236 times for over 1,500 yards and 20 touchdowns. And that included multiple 75-yard scores, has that breakaway ability, but also runs with his pads over his knees, that willingness to work through contact and bleed out yards. Has experience in passing downs, pretty solid as a protector or receiver. So really in a zone-based system, I really like his ability to stick his foot in the ground and explode through a line of scrimmage. There is some room to become more efficient with his footwork overall. And while I do appreciate the fight that he puts in, he needs to understand the importance of protecting the ball in crowded spaces, where he's just trying to fight for the last couple of inches instead of making sure the ball is wrapped up. I don't think he's going to cut much into the playing time of Nick Chubb or Kareem Hunt, just because those guys are established players and the best do in the NFL. But Ford can return some kicks and probably allows him to move on from Hunt maybe next year, because he is kind of a similar player in terms of the skill set that he brings to the table. So just in terms of the pure value, I love it because I think I had him in the 70s on my personal big board. Just feels like a bit of a luxury pick, even though I can get on board with it. Then Woods, who transferred from Arkansas to Oklahoma after 3 years there and was the number 3 option for the Sooners last year. Didn't think anything really stood out about him, and he's probably going to be a target for special teams mostly. So don't want to get too much into him. But then Isaiah Thomas, I like quite a bit. Has some jolt in his hands to create force in the run game and be disruptive. And for his size, he flashes a pretty impressive ability to corner his rushes, along with his long arms, giving him some room for error on those hand swipes. I'd say he was a pretty average tester in measurements across the board, other than his height and large hands. Gets way too hang up with jostling against blockers and overshooting his gaps at times, which allows guys to push him from the side and create some lateral movement. But I definitely like him as a rotational piece with inside-out flexibility. Still kind of looking for the right landing spots, but I think he can make an impact for the Browns as a rotational piece. And then finally, Deaton, who's a 3-year starter at center for the Red Raiders, and brings some plus athletic movement skills, as well as good activity with his hands to refit them. But there is some inconsistency in his pad level, and he leads into too many blocks, so that's a bit of an issue where guys can pull him off to the side. But as I look at this class as a whole, I think Winfrey and Ford are home run picks, but I didn't really love this draft as a whole with how do you prioritize players. Emerson I like quite a bit as a long physical corner, but he's going to be the number 4 in that group, having picked one in the first last year and another one in the second, as well as giving the big money to Denzel Ward. Wright being more of a developmental player who I don't see as that guy who can really take advantage of playing across from Myles Garrett right away. Bell I liked as a receiver who may have limited upside in terms of the speed or explosiveness perspective. He can be a productive player for them as the number 3 right away. Then Winfrey is a penetration style player, may not be exactly what they needed on the interior, but he was a great value pick. We talked about my thoughts on the kick in the 4th. Ford once again, maybe a luxury selection, but I'm a huge fan of. Woods doesn't really move the needle for me, but then they get 2 guys late in Thomas and Deaton, who can be solid depth pieces. So overall, it's kind of a meh for me, considering they didn't have any picks in the first 2 rounds, but then 6 picks between the 68 and 156, where you really get the meat of your roster, so to speak. And really the only guy that I see being better than 3rd at his position for the Browns this season is Winfrey, so I don't love that. They already had a great roster, but not to the point where depth was the main priority and they needed to bring in some playmakers, which has us moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers, the final team here for today, and the only team to select a quarterback in either the 1st or the 2nd round. When he made Kenny Pickett the 1st pick here, 20th overall, which I'll get to now, along with 3 picks after that I really liked. Because like I said, 20th overall, Kenny Pickett, quarterback, Pittsburgh. Then 2nd round, 52nd overall, George Pickens, the wide receiver out of Georgia. 3rd round, 84th overall, DeMarvin Leal, the interior defensive lineman out of Texas A&M. 4th round, 138th overall, Calvin Austin III, wide receiver, Memphis. 6th round, 208th overall, Connor Hayward, the fullback / tight end out of Michigan State. And then 2 7th round picks, Mark Robinson, linebacker, Ole Miss, and Chris Ilodokun, quarterback, South Dakota State. Starting with Pickett here at the top, who had pretty modest production for his first 4 years with Pitt, but then kind of exploded with over 4,300 passing yards and was responsible for 47 total touchdowns compared to only 7 interceptions. He ran a lot of pro-style concepts and kind of plays the quarterback position like it's supposed to be in terms of being able to quickly process information and work through his reads, delivering the ball accurately for the most part. But he brings us something off script in terms of being able to escape the pocket, has that 4.7 speed, and pretty good accuracy delivering on the run. The 2 main issues that I just have with Pickett here are that his mechanics and his game overall completely break down when there's color flashing up the middle, in terms of just pressure where he's bailing on clean pockets, And then in high leverage moments, just kind of everything unraveling for him at times, as well as the obvious thing that everybody's been talking about, only 8.5-inch hands, so there's some issues in terms of controlling the football. And then in inclement weather, I know that he played at Pitt and he's kind of playing in the same stadium, but in terms of looking at the ball being a little bit bigger, and there was not a lot of games at Pitt where you saw it become an issue. I think the second half against North Carolina, you saw him losing control of the football, and as well as at the Senior Bowl, the second day, where everybody struggled with the rain, but with him it was almost unwatchable in terms of him not being able to control the football whatsoever. So I'd say Mitchell Trubisky probably has a 60-40 advantage to start week 1, but to me, Pickett, in terms of the mental makeup, certainly ready to play. I just question the ceiling that he has, especially can he really lead it to a Super Bowl with all the elite AFC quarterbacks? Just kind of comes down to philosophy. Is a guy like that worth a first-round pick? Personally, he was my number 5 QB in this class, which I understand is a lot lower than most people. But just looking at the next quarterback not coming off the board for another 54 picks, very simplified way to look at it, but just he's not going to be that much better than the next guy. Then we got George Pickens in the second round, however, who I like a lot. Led the Bulldogs in receiving as a true freshman. Always been a productive player, despite inconsistent quarterback play as long as he was healthy. Although he did miss almost all of last season recovering from a torn ACL. Just you saw that ability to be a playmaker. Just looking at the numbers, more than 50% of his career catches resulting in touchdowns. At the combine running a 4.47, so better than most people expected, and coming back from an injury to 100%. Just really a boundary specialist in terms of being able to win on your stat at route tree, make plays on the back shoulder fades, stuff like that. Just tremendous ability to judge the flight of the football, position his body for it, and then winning contested situations. Does have some room to improve with his ability to stack DBs on vertical routes, since he doesn't quite have that extra juice to detach vertically. There's an obvious concern with his health, even missing time before this last season, so that's really the big thing with him. But I think if he's totally healthy, he is a slam dunk pick here. Pittsburgh does move their receivers around a lot, but I think Pickens probably a steady presence on the boundary and allows you to do a lot of different stuff with the other guys there. Having lost Juju Smith-Schuster, that whole receiving corps, reformulating it a little bit to some degree here. Then in the third, to Marvin Leal, one of the leanest 290-pound guys you will ever find, and his first step is more so edge rusher-like, I would say. Flashes impressive force in his hands and can create some penetration with his slippery style of play in the run game, as well as being very flexible to reduce his surface area and work around blockers and rush downs, which makes him kind of this hybrid player who can play all over the line in terms of passing downs. At one point a good year ago, he was looked at as a potential top 10 pick, but fell all the way to the third round due to never quite living up to the hype. Has to do a better job of feeling contact on an angle and countering it, down blocks, especially at double teams, got uprooted a lot of times. And he's just kind of a tweener where I wasn't 100% sure where to project him as. But for the Steelers, primarily going to be coming on passing downs probably early on with that inside versatility. And if there's one spot where he can really develop with all the bodies that they have there and guys who can teach him the tricks of the trade, I had him valued as a late second, early third round pick. So this is a value selection for them. And then great value they also got with Calvin Austin, the wide receiver at Memphis. Former state champion in multiple track disciplines and finished top 3 at the position at the combine with a 4.32 in the 40 and both the jumps. You saw it back in 2020. One of my favorite tapes of him gave Cincinnati's Sauce Gardner some real issues, forcing him to grab his jersey off the line. Has that explosiveness and quickness off the line to get cleanly off press attempts where it's really tough to just get a hand on him. And you saw it at the Senior Bowl as well, where he was voted the American Wide Receiver of the Week, just because people weren't able to touch him a lot of times, and also after the catch brings that explosiveness to the table to create big plays. His size is just diminutive at 5'8", 175 pounds, which also brings a very limited catch radius. When defensive backs are close to him, they can really wrap around his body, and he won't bring you much in contested situations probably, but just a guy that you can move up and down the formation and deliver some explosive plays as your number 4 receiver. I really love that, and that's also the story like I already talked about, snatching him 1 pick ahead of Baltimore. That makes a lot of sense here. Then we get to Connor Hayward, who the best way to describe him is probably he's just a football player. This guy can play tight end, fullback, H-back, he can be an up-back on punts, cover kicks, everything that you really ask of him. He does like any high-level athletic traits and may always stay more of a role player, but he's clearly just there trying to build a family tree, now with 4 sets of brothers, so That's kind of crazy, but I think he can be a quality piece for them on offense and special teams, even though, like I said, more of a role player probably. Robinson, I did not study specifically. I watched the other Ole Miss linebacker, Chance Campbell, who has some interesting skills and tested extremely well. Robinson, pretty good athlete himself, but he's also half an inch short of 6 feet, lacks great instincts, and it's probably a pure special team selection. But then Oladokun is a pretty fun quarterback, has a whippy arm to drive the ball to the intermediate areas, and set his guys up for run-after-catch opportunities, as well as put the right arc on deep balls. He shows some crazy awareness for defenders around him, and at times it almost looks like he has eyes in the back of his head with the way that he's aware for guys around him and can just sort of escape, find those open creases, and then also has that 4.7 speed to quickly punish defense for leaving a lane open for him. However, he will already turn 25 before ever taking his first NFL snap, and it took him until his redshirt senior year to really make a name for himself. His arm angle can get a little floppy, and he'll have to speed up his mental clock, where a lot of times the rush is closing in, he's just trying to bleed it out and make something happen, which that time is going to be shorter in the NFL, obviously, with all the speed that they have there. But I think he'll probably allow Pittsburgh to move on from Mason Rudolph, who's on a 1-year, $5 million deal, so that makes some sense here to get a cheap replacement. I try to be fair here because if you evaluate Pickett, where I had my number 1 quarterback, Malik Willis from Liberty, who would have been a bang on value at 20, I think this is actually a very good class. I think he's worth that kind of draft capital. Now, I'd heavily disagree with that and don't want to go on too much about it anymore, because personally, if Pickett isn't good enough to win it all, I'm not sure if you should ever take a quarterback in the first round. I love the 2 receivers that they got, with Pickens being this physical outside dude, and Austin is a super twitchy guy, along with the size that they already have there with Chase Claypool. They may not have a true number 1 in some people's eyes maybe, but that top 4 could be pretty darn good. Leal, I certainly have questions about where exactly his best fit is, but where they got him is later than I expected, and he's certainly a talented player. They keep adding to the family, so to speak, with Connor Hayward, who could be the Swiss Army knife for them on offense and special teams. They have more depth at linebacker, even if I think there were a bunch of guys that are like better than Robinson. And then Oladokun as this fun quarterback who could be a cheap replacement if they want to rid themselves of Mason Rudolph, which seems kind of obvious at this point, bringing in 3 quarterbacks this offseason. So once again, I disagree with the decision at the top, but if Pickett can be a franchise quarterback, and I'm in the wrong here, I can certainly see what they're doing. Which brings us to a divisional draft rankings, where clearly at the top for me, the Baltimore Ravens, just the value that they were able to acquire through 3 days, the masses of compensatory picks, and just the ability as well on draft day to move around, getting that extra first-round pick for the Cardinals for Marquise Brown. Now, my only critique would be, like I said, not finding a cheaper replacement for him at some point during the draft, which was loaded with wide receiver talent. But overall, just continuing to pick good football players, even though a couple of them, maybe the testing didn't look as great. I really love the talent that they were able to acquire here for a team that is always looking to reload and find cheaper players at valuable positions, which safety and center, maybe not quite up there in the traditional sense for the analytics people, but certainly valuable players for this particular team. Then we got the Cincinnati Bengals. Like I said, if Daxton Hill ends up being just a cheaper replacement for Jesse Bates, who I think is one of the best safeties in the NFL, I wouldn't love that, but overall the class I think very good in terms of valuable positions that they needed to address, and finding quality players who were pretty high up on my rankings, and support the other moves that they made these last 2 off seasons, really filling out that roster and to a point where they can continue to compete in a division that is going to be pretty tough over the next few years with all the quarterback talent. Then we got the Pittsburgh Steelers, who to me are clearly number 4 now in the division in terms of quarterbacks. I don't think that's even remotely a debate, and that's why even Kenny Pickett, even if he lives up to his potential, is still going to be number 4 in that division. So that's my issue with him being the pick at the top here, but I really like those 2 receivers, just getting some value pieces, some depth guys, role players late on day 3, and the Marvin Leal being somebody who has the potential to be an impact player at the next level as well, who was once looked at as this kind of unicorn prospect, but has kind of fallen from grace here. I think he can kind of get back on track here for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then finally, the Cleveland Browns. I just didn't love what they did. Don't totally understand it, because there are still some holes that they needed to fill, get that beef on the defensive line, getting another true impact receiver. I know they got David Bell in the 3rd, but I mean, is he really going to be that impact guy? I personally like him as a number 3, but They could have arguably done with a number 2 at least to move DPJ more into that third role. Getting a kicker in the 4th, I talked about that. Their third round pick, Alex Wright, I'm not a huge fan of either. So overall, just left things to be desired. I thought they were kind of just building up depth when they needed still to get those few impact players to really establish themselves in the AFC North, where now the Bengals are the kings right now because they made it all the way to the Super Bowl last year. I think the Ravens are going to really make some noise this year, coming back from all of the injuries. The Steelers still have a pretty good roster, and even if I'm not a huge fan of Pickett or Trubisky, either one of them should be a improvement over Big Ben, what he was last year, kind of broken down guy. And the Browns now bringing Deshaun Watson and clarity. Is he going to play at all? How many games could he be suspended for? We just don't really know. Certainly still one of the better rosters in the league, but kind of missed a chance here to add to it and be a competitor in this division, which is going to be fun to watch in 2022. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap up the Northern Divisions, actually. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and share it with a couple of friends. Next week, we'll talk about the NFC and the AFC East, respectively, in the way that we already did in these first 2 videos, where we go through everything in a detailed perspective and just try to talk about every team, give them the time to be in the spotlight. Once again, the link to my page on footballtalk.com for even more detailed breakdowns is in the video description, as well as my social media handles, which you can also see on the screen right now. Hope to see you next week and that you follow along with the series. So until then, see you later. Peace!